Welcome to Artsplanations, the podcast that is for non-artists, artists, and everyone in between.
Each week, we ask a different search engine a question related to art, and then we talk about it.
Hello, and welcome to the podcast. I am Joanna Bolsons, and with me, as always, is
Andrew Malcheski.
And today we are going to ask the question, when is eroticism in art no longer art, but pornography?
And if you were to try to do a internet search for this kind of question, you would get just a bunch of essays on the topic. There isn't really a quick, definitive answer to it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's kind of like the question, what is art? There's not a real defined answer anyway. We just wanted to present this question because we find it interesting.
And one of the reasons why we're saying when is eroticism in art no longer art but pornography is because we both feel that even though pornography does fall under the label of art as we defined it in our first episode, we don't think it could ever be good art or achieve the status of art with like a capital A.
Yeah, and I think the best way to back up that argument is when you define the purpose of art and then you define the purpose of pornography. The purpose of art is to push a technique, push an idea of color. You're creating imagery of some sort or a soundscape of some sort, whereas when you define pornography, the object is to masturbate.
Yeah.
The object is, or the idea and the point of pornography is the act of either self-gratification or with your partner watching it. There's no real artistic endeavor to it. You can have really nice softcore and it's not your typical pound it out, but the object, the idea is still to get off.
Yeah, and that's the thing. The end-all intent of pornography is always for that kind of sexual whatever.
And that's why we believe that pornography will never be under good art or art itself.
Because art, good art, there's always a conceptual consideration to what the thing is that the art form is that's being made, whether it's music, dance, or the visual arts. There's always layers to what is going on in that. You know, it's cultural, it's social, it's political, it is about the viewer and the work being viewed, whereas pornography has none of those things. It is only about making this thing for physical stimulus.
Yeah.
And that's it. Like, there is nothing else there. Because if there was, it wouldn't be pornography at that point. And that's kind of why we're viewing the question from this angle, is when does art kind of go too far?
Yeah. When is it no longer just something that is erotic or sensual, but it then crosses some imaginary line that then becomes pornography.
So the other thing that we have to talk about before we really get into this discussion is the fact that, you know, we are from a Western culture, which means that the general way that the Western world views nudity and artwork with nudity is a very conservative viewpoint compared to the way that the rest of the world views things.
Yeah.
Which means that someone from the West might see nudity in art as a form of pornography or something that should be censored or not shown to the general public at large and have a problem with it, whereas the rest of the world, because they aren't as conservative in their views, often don't have a problem with nudity in general.
And I'll even argue that it's more narrow than just Western, because when you're talking about the art world and you specify Western art, that also includes Europe with the United States. But I think in this instance, it's specifically the United States. Yeah. Because if you go over to Europe, they have nude beaches, they have very sexual and sensual ideals, and they accept it as part of being human, whereas it's very much
taboo here.
Yeah, very much you're going to bury that. We're not going to talk about it. It doesn't exist.
I guess the first thing we should talk about as far as like works that kind of toe the line between art and pornography.
The ones I always go to is Egon Schiele. And even I have a hard time acknowledging that it's my own American viewpoint that's making me feel uncomfortable. Because if I look at his colors and his mark making and his stylized depictions of women, they're beautiful. But it's how he poses them and how he represents them. It's very erotic and very towing the line for me. And it's not so much the marks or how he did it, it's what they're doing in them. And I have to kind of internalize and think critically within myself, like, why do I have such a problem with that? Because he had relations with these women most of the time. I think most of his paintings are of a specific prostitute he was in love with. So she was very much owning her sexuality. She chose to sit and do these things for these paintings. So obviously it wasn't he was taking advantage or anything. It just, for me, it's very much towing that line.
But do we know that he wasn't I mean, if she was a prostitute, then she was being paid for this service. I mean,
yeah.
Couldn't there be a form of exploitation of this man exploiting this woman by paying her for this service? You know, yeah, they are. Some of his paintings are explicit in that the model is performing, you know, masturbatory acts on themselves or sex acts in the actual piece itself. And so that, I would say, I mean...
That to me is pornography, but then I have to break it down. Look at the colors he's using. Look at the way he painted that. Or look at the way he outlined the figure, because it was new for his time. So I guess it's the technical aspect I can appreciate. It's what he is representing, what he is depicting in his work that I'm just like, that's too much for me.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily label his work as pornographic. Erotic, yes, but I wouldn't say so much pornographic, because I don't think that it's not something that you would pleasure yourself to, and if you did, I would say seek professional help, because they're not...
No, I wouldn't say that. I mean, people have, what's the word I'm looking for?
Kinks?
Not kinks, no. They have certain sexual responses to cars. There's some people who have sexual responses to balloons. Like, there are people who find things sexual.
Right.
And I think that's the point, though, is understanding that you're going to come at a work with your own prejudices.
Right, but I don't think his intent was for those images to be pornographic when he painted them.
You don't. I think he did. I think he wanted to push the idea of representing the form. Otherwise, why would he do it?
I don't know. Without doing any kind of like in-depth research into him.
Yeah.
The colors, the way that he's kind of laid things out, and the way that everything is kind of abstracted leads me to believe that it's not, like, though he's depicting sexual acts, they aren't, I don't know, like masturbatory in their depiction. There's like a grossness to his work in the way that he depicts the human form. It's like a beautiful grossness, don't get me wrong, but there's a...
Well, it's not gross, it's shocking.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even know if shocking is the right word.
It was shocking for its time.
Shocking for its time, but I don't think I can't think of a good word. I'm sure there's an excellent German word that perfectly encapsulates what I want to talk about. But I can't think of something like gross is as close as I can get to describing, like, because like I said, it's like a beautiful grossness. It's not like icky gross, but there's almost like a portrayal of like ugliness in how he abstracts the form. That when I see his work, even the ones where it's, you know, very much, you know, exposed people doing these things, I don't see anything like it doesn't scream me like, oh yes, this is a sexy painting, you know?
Yeah, it's erotic.
Right. It's erotic because it's depicting naked people doing sex acts, but it's not like a sexy thing that I would find arousing.
Well, you wouldn't find it arousing. Right. Other people might.
They might, but I don't think his intent was for them to be arousing paintings.
So, okay. I like the fact that we're talking about intent, because there's another artist, I can't remember his name, but he did sculptures that depicted him and his wife having intercourse, and he put them...
That is the balloon dog guy.
Coons?
Yeah.
So, I wish you wouldn't have told me his name. Now I have to automatically not care for it. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so he depicted himself and his wife having sex and put it in the middle of a gallery. That to me is pornographic, because there was no challenge to the way he did the form, to the way he represented the color. It was a sex act. And I think the only reason you would do that is to, quote, shock the viewers, quote, shock the newspapers. There is no artistic endeavor in that. And that, to me, is pornographic.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that.
Okay.
Coons in general, I don't see as any kind of... He is not a good artist, in my opinion. I'd say about 90% of the stuff that he's made, I am not a fan of, and I don't...
So we can unanimously agree that crossed the line into pornography, because there was no challenge to the mark making, to the way he did the form, and it was and the reason why I'm bringing this up, it's because it's no longer somebody sitting naked in a sensual way. It's no longer somebody alluding to the act of sex. They were straight up represented in the middle of coitus.
Right, and the only purpose for doing that was to elicit a reaction. Some kind of response. And because he put it in a gallery, it was supposed to be this shocking thing of, coitus in the gallery. I mean, this does, however, bring up another artist who did something similar, the Olympia by Manet and his Musée d'Orsay. And in both of those, he did something similar where he depicted a nude female form, and he was in Olympia, he was referencing a traditional painting, but he had stripped it away of all the high-minded symbolism that went into those kind of works.
Yeah, she was represented as a prostitute in a brothel, owning her sexuality, and all the art history books I read, they're talking about how she's confronting the viewer by staring straight at you, owning her sexuality. That is not pornography. That is sensual. That is a female knowing who she is and being at peace with it. And that's the same with Musée d'Orsay, or I think it's Luncheon on the Grass, where it's the naked female. There's a female in the foreground or background bathing. Yeah. And the men around them are clothed. They are owning who they are, and they are okay with that. It's not pornography.
Not pornography, but how does that sit with, the idea of the male gaze? And you have this male painter who is now depicting this nude female in this scene. Is he objectifying her? Could that still be seen as a kind of exploitive way to...
I think there could be an argument for that if their body language had been more trying to cover themselves up, trying to not appear as strong.
So the fact that they're in a relaxed pose, in this traditional kind of...
They weren't meek about their body.
Right.
Which brings up another idea of the female as an object versus the female as a person. And not just artwork, but specifically photography. You look at the female form in most fine art photography when they're nude, their faces are obscure, or they're hunched over to where the shadow is covering them. They're no longer a person or a form. They're an object.
Right. They have literally become the object.
Yeah. And that is somehow art, versus when the female is owning their sexuality and they are proud of their body, it's pornography. There's no sex act in any of these.
Right.
There's no touching themselves. but they are accepting their body, they are who they are, and they're looking at the camera, that is somehow pornography, versus if they're looking away or a shadow's covering their face or they're turned in such a way that, what is it, Man Ray? He turned the female form into a violin or a cello, something. That's art. You're turning the female form into an object. She's no longer a person, she's an object, but that is art. And a person just standing there, same technical aspect, same technical proficiency in the photography, but the female's represented different. That's when I have a problem with it too.
Yeah, because you're literally objectifying a figure and not, looking at who that figure is, questioning the personality of the sitter, or elevating any of those aspects in the work.
And I think that's when the male gaze versus the female gaze comes to a screeching halt with me. Because if I was to look at Richard Prince's work versus Cindy Sherman, I'm automatically going to feel more akin to Cindy Sherman, because it's a female photographer representing females with that same kind of kinship, whereas Prince is straight up objectifying.
Yeah. I mean...
And he objectifies male and female across the board, so there's no preference with him.
Yeah. And that is something that, the intent of the artist does play a part. That's why we said in the beginning, that intent of the artist plays a part. And also, the way in which things are represented in the work of art does make a difference.
Like what?
You can, if you look at, Klimt's Adele Bach-Bauer portrait, it is very much a clothed woman, but he's representing the sitter as, he's personifying her with all of the pattern and the dress that she's wearing, the background, and the way that he has the sitter staring directly at the viewer in this very confrontational, it's not confrontational, but it is a directing gaze. Like
Olympia.
Right. And even then, when that's Olympia, he is referencing Titian's Venus of Urbino, which is a classic work that everybody at the time would have known. And that was part of what was so shocking, is because it's not a Venus that he's representing. It is a known prostitute that also many of those white men would have recognized as, oh, it's that prostitute that we all know about. And that would have been part of the shock of them, the fact that she is being elevated and not relegated to, just some prostitute. She's now being elevated to the same level as the Venus of Urbino or these other Venus portraits that didn't celebrate the female form, but celebrated male ideals of what the female should be. And whereas he is now saying, well, it's not our ideals of what a female should be. This is a woman that we know. And I think that's one of the reasons why it was so shocking. And also why it's not pornography, even though it does depict a naked woman.
Yeah. I also just want to say, nudity isn't pornography.
Right.
So, a personal story. My parents had a small replica of Rodin's The Kiss in our house growing up, and I never thought twice about it. My parents always took us to museums. They never sheltered us from anything. My mom's a nurse, so you had a penis, you have a vagina. That's what it is, and very technical about everything. And I was always exposed to art as a kid, so I never questioned nudity as something you should be ashamed of. And I had a friend come over for a slumber party. We might have been in 5th grade. I don't even think that. And she immediately freaked out that we had porn in the house. She starts making fun of me, saying, "Oh, you have pornography." And it was just a sculpture of two forms leaning into kiss. I don't even think they're actually kissing in the kiss. I think
They are.
They are.
Yeah.
But they're definitely not touching... they're not fornicating. They're not doing anything besides kissing. But because they're nude, to her, it was pornography.
Right. And that draws back to the American conservative views on nudity.
And I think that idea does more harm than good, because you can see a nude figure and not sexualize it.
Right.
In fact, you shouldn't sexualize it.
Right. As artists, when we take life drawing, that's one of the things. I mean, I know the first life drawing class I had, we had a nice talk about, when you see a nude model, you are looking at the form, the shape, the shadow. It's not a sexual gaze that you're using. It is a technical one.
Yeah.
And yeah, you can look at a naked person and not view them with a sexual eye.
Yeah. You are going to be staring at them for minimum of 3 hours, because most studio classes are 3 hours.
Yeah.
You're going to be staring at them for 3 hours. In those 3 hours, those forms start to break down, and you're no longer seeing just a nude body. You're seeing a shadow. You're seeing a muscle line.
Yeah. I mean, that is a good point, that kind of conservative view on nudity is not something that we see traditionally when we look at art history, traditional art historical views. We know that because of work like the Sleeping Hermaphrodite, which it is a marble sculpture of a hermaphrodite, and it was sculpted in antiquity, lost, and then found, and then once it was found, Brancusi sculpted a marble bed for it to lay on.
So nobody knows who actually carved the hermaphrodite itself?
Correct.
Or themselves, I should say.
Yeah.
But Brancusi sculpted the bed.
Just the bed.
Okay.
Which...
That's kind of amazing.
Yeah, I could go in deeper in how awesome it is that, and how good Brancusi is that he was able to sculpt this marble bed for this sculpture that
he didn't
make, and it fits flawlessly. The same thing with the Laocoon, which was another work that we knew about in the Renaissance that had been lost in antiquity and then was refound. And the Greeks and the Romans, when they did sculptures of nude figures, it wasn't because they were like, oh look, it's naked people. It was because it was a representative of these most perfect forms.
Yeah, it was a celebration of the human form.
Yeah.
And who was it that put the fig leaves on everybody? I feel like it was some king.
I thought it was one of the popes.
Was it?
I know.
Well, he's a king in Catholicism.
Yeah, there has been periods where Christian kings and popes have gone in and censored the naughty bits out of classical works, like The Last Judgment by Michelangelo. That was censored. Mm-hmm. And then Pope John Paul II, I think, I want to say it was in the 90s, but there's so many Pope John Pauls, it's hard to tell, actually had them remove that censorship because the nude figure is not an affront.
No. And if you want to bring religion into it, which I try not to, but just look at the argument that Adam and Eve were nude in the garden.
Right.
If you believe in God, God gave you this body, you should celebrate it.
Right. It's interesting because when doing research for this podcast, we did look in to see what various Catholic...
Yeah, they were Catholic. Talking about those two guys.
Yeah, it was... I don't know, they weren't priests.
No, but they were
educators at a Catholic university, maybe?
Maybe, but they were very knowledgeable of how their religion believes, but they had a great viewpoint on everything that, yes, they are nude, but it's not sexual.
Right.
Everybody has the same body.
Yeah, and that body was a celebration of Christ's work.
Yeah.
And I think my favorite quote out of watching them was that he was like, the first commandment God gave us was be fruitful and multiply. And he didn't mean grow trees and get calculators. He meant have sex.
Yeah.
And that is part of being a person is sex. It's
and
one of the things that people do. It's
a celebration of love when done in a certain way. When you're thinking of it from that viewpoint, then sex is a celebration of your love. So I was about to say you could argue that pornography is then a celebration of love, but the intent of that
because the intent
is,
and that's the thing. So
we go back to intent then, because it's not two people celebrating and becoming closer. The intent of pornography is to get off, which circles us back to the point of this episode.
Right.
It's when a celebration of the human form is no longer about celebrating the human form and being inclusive of this human form, but then
objectifying it for
masturbatory purposes.
Right.
And I would like to throw out, though, there are some historical pieces, like if you go to Pompeii, there's proof on one of the brothel walls that they had a very popular prostitute, and apparently you should go to her for certain good acts. That is no longer pornography. That is historical antiquity. It is learning about a culture.
Right.
I think after a certain point in time, pornography can become archaeological.
And in that sense, it transcends into a different way that we view it. Because now, the intent of its initial purpose has been superseded by its historical and cultural significance.
Which I will also argue that our time, when people 1,000 years from now look back on us, that will not happen. I think the digital age and the accessibility of the internet will no longer see that as cultural significance, but a footnote.
Right. I think what will happen is that there will be certain pornographic films that have been turned into memes that will remain culturally significant due to their wide knowledge base as a
like
meme.
Deep Throat. Okay, I like the idea of the historical reference, though, because if we look at like the Indian Karma Sutra,
right,
that was a celebration of physical love. I'm not Indian. I don't know the theology of it, but I do know that's part of the culture, and it is a celebration of physical intimacy.
Right.
It's part of the culture. I don't want to speak for that culture because I've never been there, and
right. I'm not Hindu. I'm not Hindi. But I don't understand. Like, yeah.
But I do know that has lasted for, what, thousands of years? At least hundreds.
Yeah.
But that is part of the culture. You see it carved on buildings. I mean, there's obviously a book.
Yeah.
And there's nothing, while it is sex acts, you could argue that it's pornographic, but for me it's not. It's cultural, and it's part of the history.
So do you think that it was appropriated by a more conservative, like the Western audience would say, to be this, like, ideal of the ultimate sex act book? Because that's kind of
I don't think it was appropriated as the ideal sex act book. I think it was used to demonize a culture to make the Western civilization feel superior. I feel like they would have used it to, quote, look at these savages who just fornicate everywhere.
Or to, because that's something that was done with Orientalism.
Yeah.
Is it elevated, these poor savages, but you can have like a sex holiday in India.
Yeah.
Kind of thing, where like it had nothing to do with their culture, but was instead trying to celebrate the colonialization of that culture.
Because if you look at the Japanese hentai, that's been around for thousands of years, right? You know more about that one than I do. That sounds terrible. Not because you watch it, but you know more about
Wow. Just wow.
But you know more about...
So it's not hentai. There is a tradition in the woodblock carvings of depicting bizarre... Maybe it is hentai.
Well, I thought there were wood carvings. Maybe I do know more. I thought there were wood carvings of just male and female or male and male. Like, it was just sexual acts. And it was...
And there's some octopus thrown in there and some, like...
In the traditional hentai that's been around for thousands of years. Or are you talking about the new hentai?
No, I'm talking about the woodblock carvings, and I'm not 100% certain what hentai actually means.
Okay.
It's always used in association with, like, tentacle porn. Okay. But I don't know if that's the right word for it.
Well, is it then porn? Or is it art?
It was pornography.
When it first started.
Now it is definitely seen as a relic of that culture.
So then, so it was porn in the time, much like Pompeii at the brothel, that mural or whatever.
But now,
because of the historical antiquity, it is
its
art.
Significance in showing, this other side of that culture. Because if you think about traditional Japanese culture, it's very strict, very hierarchical, very much. There are a set way that you do things, a set way, almost a ceremonial-like way of living your life. You have this much rice, and you do this. You wear your kimono this way, and you respect your family figure in this way, and the head of the family, and the ruler, and the emperor. And there's a very kind of strict, and it's a very formal society, I would say.
Okay.
If you just look at, like, the traditional history of Japanese culture. And then you have these pornographic woodblock cuts, which depict very kind of bizarre things going on. It's one of the only ways you can really look at that side of the culture. Because it's not written about or depicted anywhere else. And in that sense, those works become, culturally significant and historically significant works of art. Okay. Because when we view them, we're not like, oh man, I'm gonna jerk off to these, woodblock prints. Instead, we're like, oh man, we didn't know that there was this other side to this kind of stricter, formal, cultural way of viewing things.
Kind of interesting, though, because there is still anime porn that depicts very similar stuff. So it's kind of made a giant circle back to...
I don't know if it's made a circle back to that.
Well, I mean, it kind of has, because if it started off as traditional woodblocks and became cultural antiquity, viewed as an art form to learn about the culture, like, hey, back in the day, this was happening. But now you can see anime porn with the same act, same tentacle.
But I don't know if... Yeah, like, I don't know, because that's not my kink, it's not my scene, and I'm not really knowledgeable about that culture.
I think it's interesting, though, that it could have made we should buy a burner computer and do research on a burner computer I think it's interesting that if it did make a circle back, like, what does that mean?
Right. And, that does bring up the other side of, what some artists have done is they have looked at those subcultures. People who are into, like, Robert Mapplethorpe's pictures of the BDSM community. Very graphic. Very much a unedited kind of look into that community, and you could absolutely say pornographic. But and this is where the big but comes in, is he is exposing a subculture that does not get exposure.
I think exposing is the wrong word. I think he's documenting.
Documenting
because
a subculture that doesn't get that kind of documentation and isn't seen as, a normative cultural act, is seen as abnormal.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's what Betty Page did. She brought kind of a lightheartedness. What?
I would say an awareness to it, for one.
Well, I don't even think it was an awareness. I think it was very much hush-hush. They didn't want awareness. I think she brought a lightheartedness to it. Yeah. She enjoyed it. She made it fun. She knew what she was doing, and she celebrated it. And I guess Mapplethorpe was kind of doing the same thing. You guys, it's consensual. I'm going to document it in an artistic way.
Yeah. I mean, similar things have been done with like punk groups and the gay and lesbian community. Mm-hmm. That kind of documentation is just not, mid-coitus or about these different kinks that people have. And I mean, and that is one of those areas where, like, is that art crossing into pornography at that point?
I think it's art journalism.
But is it pornography? Like, the intent, like, we've talked so much about the intent. The intent is to...
I think the journalism aspect, the documentation aspect, they were preserving a time, they were preserving documentation of a group in an artful way.
Then could you say that Playboy could be doing the same thing? I mean, there's a Playboy reporter as part of the White House press corps, right? They write serious articles in their magazine.
Granted, my idea of Playboy was very much from the 90s, because that 80s and 90s was when I grew up. And I'm going to automatically say no, because it wasn't a group that came together naturally. It was one man who liked small, big-boobed, blonde women, and they repeated that imagery by bringing all these girls in to a house. It felt very exploitative. The women might have come in thinking they wanted that, and some of them might have enjoyed it, but it felt very exploitative. And it was very much pumping out the same type.
Well, I would say it's still pornography because, like, even though they have journalists and articles in there that have nothing to do with sex...
we're in agreement there.
The pictures are still pornographic.
Right. But I was comparing it to... Who was it that was doing the... Mapplethorpe that was doing the BDSM. That, to me, is art journalism. He discovered a group that was doing this on their own, and he just documented it, versus Hefner, who had this idea of what he thought was sexy, and he just made millions off of it.
Right. His intent was...
Exactly. His intent was to get men to jerk off and give him money for the pleasure of doing so. Mapplethorpe, his intent was to document.
I think we also have to bring up Sally Mann.
Right.
Because her photographs are controversial because...
Wrongly so, I will say.
Yeah, I would say wrongly so, but also, I mean, in the same sense, they're unsettling. The 4 or 5 of them. So before we get into it, let's tell people what they are. So Sally Mann is a photographer who photographed her children.
Photographed her children at home.
In a natural state of play, going about, and that's not all that her work is, but her most well-known work is
the controversy of her children at home, playing in the backyard, a lot of times in their underwear or just nude.
Right. And so, obviously the base criticism was that it's, child pornography.
Which I'm going to argue against. You know how many times I was running around my backyard naked? Half my childhood.
Right. That's how kids play.
Exactly. And maybe you could argue that it was exploitative. They didn't give their consent, but they also grew up knowing their mom was a photographer.
Yeah. That's part of who she is.
Yeah.
And I would also say that, not child pornography because the intent, and very clearly the intent, is documentational. And she is capturing a moment and an innocence of youth not caring about those kind of things.
I think if you see these photographs and automatically think child pornography, you should absolutely look into yourself and question why.
Right.
Because either there's something repressed within yourself, or you need to look at the views that you've taken in from your surroundings, because it's not.
Yeah. Once again, when we're talking about artwork that kind of crosses the line of pornography, or even, questions that line, this is a case where looking at it, I think you do have to ask, like, oh, naked kids, red flag right there, what is going on here? And you should investigate what is going on in these photographs. And if you do that, you will see that, these are documentation, or there's something deeper going on here. There's a story and a narrative that...
The one that I always think of is, there's like, one of her kids is pushing a baby doll in a stroller, and she's got a candy cigarette. And I remember reading an article that it was pushing the idea of cigarettes to kids and blah, 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 blah. It was a candy cigarette. I remember eating those as a kid. Mm-hmm. I remember pretending to smoke on the schoolyard whenever it was cold out, and the steam from your mouth.
Yeah.
It's kids being kids. And she was documenting that innocent child pretending to be a mom.
Right.
That I love.
Yeah. And, it is a honest view of that.
Yeah.
That she has taken and documented.
So I guess it's like our episode, What is Art?
I don't think it is, though.
I do. No. It's undefinable because...
It is absolutely definable. We defined it.
I don't think we did.
We did this for What is Art as well. We defined what is art.
But it's all your internal perception.
No, it's not.
I think it is, because...
It's all intent. It is the artist's intent and the viewer's intent in the viewership.
But if you don't know the artist, how can you find his intent or her intent?
Your intent. It should be very much relative.
It's your intent. It's your perception that you're bringing to it. So that internal line, when that gets crossed, I think you should question, why is it being crossed? And then you can kind of delve deeper into it. But it's an internal... What was that politician? He said, I can't define pornography, but I know it when I see it.
I think it was a Supreme Court justice.
Was that who that was? I hate to agree with the Supreme Court justice, but it's an internal line that gets crossed. And instead of just automatically shutting it down when it gets crossed, I think you should stop, question why that line is a barrier for you, and then kind of decide for yourself. Am I being prejudiced against this because of my conservative views, or is this actually pornography?
Yeah, I would say when you look at any artwork, it is always in your best interest to go into it with an open mind. And if you don't like what you see, or you have prejudices against it because of certain imagery, do some research and find out the intent behind why the imagery is there, and think about what it is that makes you have those kind of feelings towards it. But when it comes to, is it art or is it pornography, I think there's a very clear line that you can say.
I think there's a clear line when it comes to painting, when it comes to sculpture. I think photography and video, this new age era, I think that's when it becomes very much blurred.
Yeah, I will say absolutely. With photography and video, it is, I think, because of the ubiquity of the camera, especially now with everybody having one on their phone, and because
the accessibility of it and the over what's the word I'm looking for?
Saturation.
Yeah, oversaturation.
Due to the internet as well, it is, and I think also because pornography does have an element of exploitation built into it, that the camera is it's so easy to just take someone's image and without their consent.
Yeah, it's very cold.
Yeah.
It's very easy to just get lost.
Yeah. Well, that would turn kind of dark at the end.
Yeah, that did. I'm sorry.
No, but that's part of I don't know what the definition is, but I'll know it when I see it. That's part of the thing that you know when you see is that, like, ooh, this is not consensual.
That's what I just said, and you argued against me. That's what... Okay, so you are agreeing with me.
I guess I am.
Score 1 for Joanna.
Yeah, score 1 for Joanna. My point was that you can tell the difference between pornography and art. Internally.
And when that line is crossed...
Define it! We're getting nowhere here.
So...
Let's agree that we agree on most of it and move on. To sum everything up, I think that the best thing that we can say is, for us, it is all about the intent of the thing being looked at. The artist's intent and the viewer's intent. And those two things are what define the line for when art can cross over to pornography. So that's been our discussion on when is eroticism in art no longer art but pornography. And honestly, we didn't do that great of a job nailing it down into a concrete, defined thing. And I don't think you can, because it depends on the intent of the artist and partially the intent of the viewer.
Yeah, we didn't really expect to answer it because it's about your own personal perception, but hopefully we brought some new ideas to
the way that you view nudity in art, and also opened you up to reserving judgment on some things that you might think are problematic or pornographic.
Yeah.
And we did say that, Western culture is more conservative, and that's not to, demonize that perception.
Yeah, it's
just a fact of the world we live in, is that Americans tend to be more conservative overall when it comes to nudity than the rest of the world.
Yeah, it's not to put one above the other or to make fun of where we're from. It's just, this is how Americans are typically raised.
Yeah.
So, anyway, hopefully you enjoyed this episode. As always, I am Joanna.
And I'm Andrew.
And hopefully you are you. Thank you for listening to our podcast. It means so much that you would take the time to listen to us. If you like what you hear and would like to help us out, please give us a review and like on your podcast app and iTunes. Comment and tell your friends and family. We would also like to thank the Joy Drops and Free Music Archive for our music.
We want to have a conversation. This means that any research we do for a subject is often done a week or two before we record, and our notes are minimal. This also means that as we talk about things, we might make mistakes, like in the pronunciation of names or the misattribution of a statement or a piece of work, and the messing up with titles and dates. If we do and we notice, we'll put a correction in the show notes. And if we don't, let us know so that we can.
The best place to contact us is on our website, www.artsplanations.com. There you can find out more about us, the show, and each episode.
You'll be able to find every artist quote and most of the specific vocabulary we use in each episode, as well as a list of upcoming topics.
We invite you to join the conversation, so please let us know what you think. If you have suggestions or topics for discussion, you can let us know at our website, www.artsplanations.com.
If you are curious about our artwork, the best place to find it is on our Instagrams. I'm at Andrew Malczewski, that's at AndrewMalczewski.
And I'm at joanna.bolsons.artist. That's JOANNA.BOLSINS.ARTIST.
These links and others can be found on the Artsplanation website. That's www.artsplanations.com. www.artsplanations.com.